It's time for the chip race.
For our strategy segment this week, we welcome back our good friend, the cashiest man in England. He's Nice Guy Ambassador Andy Hills. Andy, welcome back to the show.
Hello, Andy.
Now, Andy, before we start, I have two things I need to say. One, you have to stop flaunting your love on social media. You're worse than the granite these days, and we all know that's going to end in tears.
Okay.
And secondly, I've got to say, Andy, that when I told Dara that I wanted to get you on to discuss a hand, his eyes widened. You are known for your deep dives into hands. Then I told him you would be free to record it on the 26th or 27th, and he insisted that I must have misheard you, and what you really said was you were free to record it from the 26th until the 27th.
Yep.
I have to say, though, as long and rambling as Andy's hand histories are in person, I was really impressed by the hand he sent through. All of the information, as succinct as possible. It literally couldn't be better. If anybody wants coaching on how to write up hand histories, I strongly suggest they go to Andy.
Well, anyway, we have high hopes, therefore, that we can figure out a way to finish this one up before nightfall. The hand comes from the Battle of Malta from last year, Andy. An absolutely huge field to which you managed to navigate all the way to 6th place and a very tidy score. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So 15 remaining, as I recall, from a field of, I think, 3,800 or so. You already have 13k locked up. Next pay jump, I know, was going to be 13th position for 17k. Very top-heavy structure in this one, 300k for first. So really a lot of your equity in those top spots. So it's worth probably ramping up the variance somewhat. Not that you are ever somebody to shy away from such variance. Blinds are 80, 160 with a 160 big blind ante. And maybe you could give us a little bit of a rundown as to the dynamics at the table and maybe your dynamics with the villain in particular.
Well, the short answer to that is there isn't a lot of dynamic. I was having to make some decisions in this particular hand with very little information to go on. So some of it was based on the demographic of my opponent and feel reads as to whether someone would bluff or not. It was folded around to the guy in the small blind who was one of the chip leaders, but I'd only been moved to this table. There was a redraw at 16 left, and I'd only been here for a short amount of time. Never played a hand against this guy, and I'd only seen him play one hand.
I'll call the action and we'll kick off from there. Abdallah Fakhruddin, your villain in the small blind, and you do have a note here that he was a possible chip leader. He raises to 480k, 3x the big blind, and you call with the ace-6 offsuit. Seems pretty reasonable to me. You know, you don't really want to 3-bet an ace-6 in this spot against the chip leader. Maybe you would against somebody who that 3-bet would have leverage against. I'm not sure. Dara, what do you think?
Yeah, I think if this was a cash game or if it was early in turn, we could possibly go either way with this hand. I think calling is probably the more standard option, but we could sometimes raise it. But I think given the ICM situation and the fact that we're covered by the possible chip leader, it's definitely a clear call.
I can't say I loved any option here. Ace-6 off is, of course, the worst ace. It flops badly, but we do have position, so it does seem too strong to fold. But as you say, 3-betting not that appealing. Suddenly I'm playing a really big pot, and I don't know whether this guy's a folder. The other problem is people's range for opening 3x in a small blind varies immensely. Some people have an enormous limping range, which means their raising range can be really strong. So Ace-6 off could be behind that range, potentially. So when I flat call, I could be doing it thinking that I'm actually behind quite a lot.
Yeah, but we do have position and we're getting a pretty good price. So I think that makes the call better.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Well, to the flop, the pot is 1.2 million. Flop comes down 10 of hearts, 7 of spades, 6 of spades. And the action goes check, check. What are we making from that, Andy? Obviously, that's a board that probably is supposed to hit your range harder. Although, as you said, such wide ranges for both of you here. Maybe it's hard to ascertain who's ahead or who's behind.
Yeah, his check can be just a straightforward give up. Both good and bad players check here just because they don't like the flop and they know it could hit me. I've actually made third pair, but there is some argument for betting here, almost purely for protection and partially to define his range. But I decided to keep the pot small and see what happens on a turn and hope I didn't get too bad a turn.
Yeah, I think this is a board where, the ranges are so wide that I don't think either player can be said to have any real range advantage on this board. Maybe we have a slight edge, but I think it's pretty close. Because of that, we can't just go ahead and bet willy-nilly, and similarly, he can't bet willy-nilly either. In this spot, if it was me, if he'd checked, I'd actually be pretty relieved that he had checked and I didn't have to put any more chips into the pot at this stage with ace-6. I think if ICM wasn't a factor, this is a hand on the flop. We could either bet or check. Either option would be fine. I think with ICM, I definitely prefer checking.
Yeah, I got to agree with that. Also, now, this hand will get more interesting, I promise. The turn is the 3 of clubs. He bets 975k into the pot of 1.2 million, and you make the call. Now, having checked the flop, he's obviously maybe decided not to define his range too much either. So what are you making of this bet, Andy?
Well, it was an unusually large bet. And most people bet a little bit smaller with their value range here. The kind of hands I fear are pocket nines and pocket eights, maybe ace seven. Those hands make an awful lot of sense to check the flop to pot control, because he doesn't want to just isolate my 10x and build too big a pot with second pair. But there was a little bit of timing going on here. On the flop, he checked relatively quickly, so I didn't think that he was slow playing like a really big hand too often. He seemed to check maybe a little bit too quickly to have been trapping me. Perhaps if he had flopped the nuts with like 9-8, you could potentially go for the check raise. But I think at this stage of the tournament, a lot of people play the hand a little bit more straightforward. They might just bet out, play a little bit more honestly than normal.
Yeah, I think this is essentially a blank turn, so it doesn't really change too much. I mean, on the flop, I said I thought that neither player had a significant range advantage. It's very close. I think that's still the case. Maybe the range advantage has switched around from a slight edge to us to a slight edge to him after we check, given that we would bet a lot of our stronger hands, presumably for protection on the flop. But I still think it's so close that it doesn't really matter. I think if ICM wasn't a factor, neither player can really bet too much on this card. But because ICM is a factor, because he covers us and he can actually apply pressure, I think that's actually started to already shape the way the hand is played. If, for example, the stacks were flipped and we covered him, then I think we could bet a lot more hands on the flop and put the pressure on. I think because he covers us, once the flop goes check, check, he can bet and start applying pressure with more hands than he could perhaps if this was the first hand of the tournament. So given that he's probably betting, or at least he should be betting reasonably wide, I think we have a slam dunk call. I mean, there's no point in raising the hand, and the hand feels far too strong to fold. We're very high up our range at this point. So for me, it's a clear call.
Yeah, already I feel like it's quite a fishy bet. As Andy said, the sizing's so big, it doesn't really make a huge amount of sense, and maybe that's already making us feel like we're in quite an unusual spot.
I kind of disagree on the sizing. I think this is actually a pretty good sizing for him to go with his entire range, because if he was, checking a value hand on the flop to underrepresent, he should be looking for value now. And similarly with the bluff part of his range, he wants to put more pressure on us given the ICM. So I actually think this is probably a good bet size for him to use on the turn with most of his range.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, Andy, what do you think of that?
Well, it's all very well discussing what would be a good bet sizing to use, but we have to remember we're playing against what I perceive to be an amateur player here. So just because he should bet a certain size, it doesn't mean he would bet that size. So it can just be a protection bet. Amateurs think too much in terms of protection rather than getting value. So if he ever checked the flop with a value hand, as Dara said, it doesn't not make sense for him to go quite big with 9s or 8s or ace 7. And regardless of whether it makes sense, I think a lot of amateur players would bet that size.
Okay, so in terms of his range when he bets this size, I mean, if we split his range down between like clear value hands, weaker value hands that are going for protection, and then out and out bluffs, you think maybe the middle part of that range, the protection part, is overrepresented?
I would say lots of pocket 9s, lots of pocket 8s, ace 7, they're the ones that make the most sense. And also, I will say that the trap of the modern fixation on PO Solver and GTO is that PO Solver might say that he should check call the flop with some 10x, which I certainly personally would, but you might find a lot of amateur players just always bet with their 10. Yeah. Any 10, they always bet with it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. Most players aren't really balanced in these spots, particularly amateur players.
Well, it's always really interesting when the amateur player maybe does sort of stumble into the same line as PO Solver, looking to do the right thing for the wrong reason. That may or may not be the case in this spot. Of course, you've profiled the guy, but we don't know really how strong he is. On the river, things get very funky now. We got the 3 of diamonds. That obviously pairs the board. There are possible straights out there. The flush did not get there. And he bets 3.4 million into 3.15 million, a kind of 1.1x over bet of the pot. Definitely not the kind of bet you were hoping to face, although obviously he's putting chips into the pot that you could win now, Andy. But at the same time, this is an uncomfortable spot.
It absolutely is. He's now extremely polarized. I mean, there are a small number of hands that make absolutely loads of sense here, but it is quite a small number. So pocket 3s makes an awful lot of sense. He could have hated the flop with pocket 3s. He's made his set on the turn and bets really big for protection / value. But of course, there's only one combination of that now because he's made quads. So that's actually a good thing for us. He just doesn't have 3s very often.
Yeah, what would you think about other sets? I guess sometimes players will decide to be trappy with their sets. Obviously, if he has sixes or sevens, it's a very good flop bet. Maybe even with tens, it's a very good flop bet. That board is pretty wet. But at the same time, a lot of players will think, oh, I've hit a set now. I can't do too much here. I have to let him catch up a bit.
Absolutely. I'm absolutely assigning him a certain percentage of pocket tens, specifically pocket tens, and of course quad threes. But I'm not going to give him every combination of tens just because he's got to consider betting that.
Well, looking at this one, Dara, now you have the PO information in front of you, but I'm also interested to know, because we are diverging from PO a lot in this one, to really kind of weigh up our opponent and their capabilities and try and find what might be the best decision we can in game as well. This is fishy. Like, we're certainly facing a fishy line, and when you face a fishy line, it sort of seems like, as Andy said, he could have backed into a monster, or he could have had a monster that he played a bit weird from the start. The other big possibility is, of course, that he's just bluffing.
Yeah, I mean, we have a pure bluff catcher. I mean, that's what it comes down to. So whether or not to call depends on whether we think he's over bluffing or under bluffing. I think at equilibrium, this is almost a push between calling and folding. So either option is fine. If we think he's over bluffing, we obviously should call. And if we think he's under bluffing and is more weighted towards value when he takes this line, then we should fold.
And Andy, when you were weighing up the, shall we say, live components this hand, getting to stare at your villain, you've obviously done a bit of profiling as well. What are you feeling are the answers to Dara's questions there?
This is really interesting because the fact that there's 15 left in such a colossal tournament is extremely important. So if I was playing a local £200 competition in Blackpool on day one, so there's not a lot of pressure on, I would call this in a heartbeat. Facing this line, I just think people bluff too much. If a pro took this line, check flop, bomb turn, overbet river, I'm really worried about it being very, very value heavy. But when an amateur does it, it can potentially be completely the other way. So if I can look at this person and believe that they're capable of having a bluff here, if I can imagine myself in their shoes doing this bluff, then I call. But there's 15 left in a massive tournament, and amateur players fall into two camps here. There's people that are capable of pulling the trigger here, and there's people who aren't capable of pulling the trigger here. I think most of them are not capable of pulling the trigger.
So you feel that under bluffing is more likely than over bluffing?
That was my concern, and I did take a long time before I made my final decision. The first thing that made me consider that he might be over bluffing, though, was just the fact that he was the chip leader. People get a little bit chip drunk sometimes.
And another factor is that a lot of amateur players, they have this idea that when they're chip leader, they have to apply maximum pressure, and they actually play quite differently from the way they do normally.
Absolutely. He might get outside of his usual comfort zone.
Yeah, and just think, well, now I have to put the pressure on, play for the win, and all those other things that people say to each other.
Also, the fact that he's got the chip lead, he could have got his chip lead by being a trigger puller.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. We are sort of focusing on the fact that he's an amateur player and trying to read into that. I mean, one thing I would say is that his line does make sense. I mean, this is by no means an outlandish way to play his range against your range. So it's possible that we're not giving him enough credit here, and he's actually playing very close to optimally.
Absolutely. There's plenty of value hands that make sense. A lot of them have a question mark hanging over them. He could have had something like 5-4. He could have just decided not to c-bet with his straight draw on the flop, which I don't think is a terrible thing to do. So there are hands that he can have, but I couldn't think of many hands where there wasn't at least one street where there is, a question mark hanging over his action on that street or the bet sizing he chose.
Yeah, I think it could make sense for him to have a bad 3 as well, like a hand like 5-3, 4-3 might check the flop, or 6-3 if he has those types of hands. I actually looked at this hand in PO just to see how close to PO his play was, and actually PO has a lot of hands that he chooses to bet to this size on the river, including all of his 3x and all of his 10x, and it even bets his stronger 7x, and that's obviously the value part of the range, and then it balances that out with various missed draws like 8-5, etc. So I think it's possible for him to have quite a decent amount of value hands still.
Yeah, if this was sort of a reg on reg encounter, I feel he could absolutely bomb the river with a load of 10x. Like if he's pot controlled some jack 10 off or something on the flop, you could go virtually pot turn overbet river, knowing that you have got the best hand, absolutely loads. But I just don't think that amateur players do that very often. They don't go as thin for value.
Yeah, I have to totally agree there. If he is betting all his tens in this spot, I really like it, and it's a really sophisticated bet, but I'm not sure we can give him too much credit for that, given the profiling you've done. In the end, Andy, as Dara said, you have a bit of a bluff catcher. I guess you basically have maybe ace high in this situation. Maybe he would turn some better ace highs into a bluff in a similar way, although that does seem strange across all the streets. So what ultimately made you decide that this was a good candidate for a call, given all the pressure, given the fact that you were so deep in such a big tournament with so much up top?
I decided that his value range was not super narrow, but quite narrow. And it just came down to whether I really believed this guy could be bluffing. So I did actually study him a little bit. So there was one extra interesting detail on the river. He took quite a long time to bet. Now that in itself doesn't tell you very much. It could be that he's mustering up the courage to make a big bluff, but it could also be, because he is representing a monster hand, it also is credible that he's trying to work out what's the biggest amount that he could get paid. So that in itself isn't a really big tell. But after making his bet, he had mirrored shades, which he had on throughout the whole hand, and he took the shades off, which I thought was quite interesting.
Oh, wow.
You could say the jury's out as to what that means. I mean, there isn't a clear interpretation of that. You could say that would often be demonstrating some degree of comfort.
Yeah.
It's quite hard to reveal your eyes when you're lying.
Yeah.
Quite hard to make eye contact and so on. So it could have been a strength thing, or it could have been a calculated attempt to look strong if he was bluffing. So again, it's not a clear-cut one. So I thought if he is bluffing, I'll try and make him feel a little bit uncomfortable. So I looked at him and said, that's quite brave of you to take your shades off, to see if I could get an immediate reaction from him. And he took just a short amount of time, he appeared to be processing what I just said, and then put the shades back on. and then turned his head just slightly away from me. Now, again...
He's quite brave too, in a way.
Yeah, this isn't clear cut. That could be that he's trying to look strong. However, he did give off some, what I thought were anxiety tells. Even though he had the shades back on, he actually had some kind of twitching in his face, some tells that you can't fake. And since he's representing such a nutted hand, I don't think he's now that anxious if he's got a really strong hand.
Dara, in final summation, he makes the call, and it's a good call. Our opponent here, Abdallah, was bluffing. What do we make of it?
Yeah, I think it's a really good call, because I think all of that live stuff, pretty much all of it, you could read both ways. I mean, even the twitching could be just excitement. It's really hard to interpret that stuff, particularly since we don't have any history with this player. So we've no way of correlating those different behaviors to his actual hang strength, where we are just kind of going on population tendencies. I do think that the decision on the river is literally on a knife edge. We could go either way. As I said earlier, I think it's whether we think he's bluffing too much or too little. So in those spots, it is really good to do what Andy did and try and gather as much physical information as possible and let that be your deciding factor. Zach Elwood talks about this quite a lot in his book, how like some people overrate tells and they make ridiculous divergences from normal strategy based on tells, but that really what we should be doing is just looking at the guy physically, trying to decide whether we think it's more likely that he's bluffing or not based on the way he's behaving, but only applying that in situations where it is a very close decision, as it is in this case.
Well done, Andy. It was certainly one of the key hands that propelled you to sixth place. It was certainly a fascinating hand. I'm pretty sure the sun hasn't quite gone down yet, although it is twilight where I am. Andy Hills, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy.